Sometimes the heart finds what it truly needs when we stop demanding what we think we want. After 500 years of solitude, even immortals can forget what genuine companionship feels like. Lord Alaric had arranged for a perfect bride through ancient blood pacts. He expected a delicate maiden to arrive at his crumbling castle. Instead, Elsbeth stepped from the merchant's cart, a robust, middle-aged woman who looked at his Gothic estate and asked practical questions about heating and proper meals. She wasn't intimidated by his brooding silences or impressed by his supernatural powers. Where he expected fear, she offered kindness. Where he demanded submission, she gave honest conversation. This plain-spoken woman would teach an ancient vampire that true partnership isn't about perfection. It's about finding someone brave enough to see past centuries of loneliness. Could love bloom between two souls society had written off? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Ravenshollow Manor like a shroud, wrapping the ancient stone walls in ethereal fingers that seemed reluctant to release their grip. Lord Alaric Blackthorn stood at his study window, watching the fog drift through the overgrown gardens where once manicured hedges now grew wild and untamed. 5 centuries had taught him that time was both his greatest enemy and closest companion, but this particular dawn felt different. Heavy, pregnant with possibility or disaster, he could never tell which until it was far too late to change course. The manor itself told the story of gradual decline. Once, these halls had echoed with laughter and music, the floors polished to mirror brightness, the walls adorned with fresh tapestries that spoke of wealth and influence. Now dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight that filtered through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in decades. The ancestral portrait gallery stretched down the main corridor like a testament to faded glory, oil paintings of previous vampire lords gazing down with expressions that seemed to grow more judgmental with each passing year. Alaric's reflection was absent from the tall mirror beside his mahogany desk, but he could feel the weight of his appearance nonetheless. Tall and lean, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that came from centuries of noble blood, he possessed the eternal youth that was both blessing and curse of his kind. His dark hair remained untouched by time, his pale skin unmarked by age, yet his steel-grey eyes held depths that spoke of too many years, too many losses, too many nights spent alone in chambers that had once housed a family. The blood-packed scroll lay open on his desk, its ancient parchment crackling when touched, the crimson ribbon that bound it faded to the color of old roses. The document represented generations of careful negotiation between vampire houses and select human nobility, arrangements that had once seemed as natural as the changing seasons. Marriage for alliance, bloodlines preserved, territories secured. Now it felt like chains forged from duty and desperation. Marcus Whitfield entered without knocking, a privilege earned through 40 years of devoted service. The elderly steward moved with the careful dignity of a man whose joints protested each morning, but whose sense of duty remained unshakable. His greying hair was neatly combed, his simple dark clothing immaculate despite the manor's general state of disrepair. In his weathered hands he carried a silver tray with Alaric's morning correspondence. "The arrangements proceed as planned, my lord," Marcus said, setting the tray on the desk with practiced precision. "The bride should arrive before midday, weather permitting. I've had the blue chamber prepared, though I confess the furnishings are not what they once were." Alaric nodded absently, his attention still fixed on the mist-shrouded landscape. "Tell me, Marcus, do you ever wonder if we're making a mistake? This marriage, this desperate grasp at continuing a bloodline that perhaps deserves to end?" The old steward paused in his arrangement of the correspondence, his expression thoughtful. "If I may speak freely, my lord, I've watched you grow more distant with each passing decade. The loneliness is consuming you, just as it did your father and his father before him. Perhaps this union will bring more than just an heir. Perhaps it will bring you back to the living. The weight of Marcus's words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. Alaric had indeed felt the creeping madness that plagued ancient vampires, the slow dissolution of connection to anything resembling humanity. It began subtly, a gradual loss of interest in mortal affairs, a growing contempt for the brief, bright lives that flickered and died. Around him, like candle flames, without connection, without purpose beyond mere survival, the mind eventually turned inward until nothing remained but hunger and hollow existence. "The girl comes from good family," Alaric murmured, more to convince himself than to inform Marcus. "Noble blood, proper breeding, raised to understand the requirements of an alliance marriage. She'll adapt to our ways, bear children, fulfill her obligations. It's a sensible arrangement." Marcus gathered the empty teacup from the previous evening, his movements careful and deliberate. "Sensible arrangements rarely lead to happiness, my lord. But perhaps they lead to something else: partnership, respect, even affection given time." The manor's other servants moved through their daily routines like ghosts of a more prosperous past. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, had served the family for 30 years, her once plump figure now thin and angular, her recipes adapted to feeding a household of 5 rather than the dozens who had once filled these halls. Young Tom, the groundskeeper's son, was actually middle-aged now, his attempts to maintain the sprawling estate grounds a losing battle against time and insufficient resources. They were loyal, these servants, bound to the Blackthorn family by generations of service and genuine affection, despite the supernatural nature of their employer. They had watched Alaric retreat further into himself with each passing year, seen the life drain from rooms that had once been filled with warmth and conversation. Their hope for his happiness was as much about their own futures as his a lonely master made for a lonely household. The estate itself sprawled across several hundred acres of English countryside, its boundaries marked by ancient stone walls and iron gates that bore the Blackthorn coat of arms. The main house contained 27 rooms, though many had been closed off to reduce heating costs and maintenance requirements. The wine cellars, carved from natural stone, housed both vintage bottles and more specialized storage that Alaric preferred not to contemplate too deeply in daylight hours. Financial pressures had mounted steadily over recent decades. While vampire longevity provided certain advantages in accumulating wealth, it also created unique challenges. Investments required careful management across centuries, and Alaric's increasing withdrawal from worldly affairs had left such matters largely in Marcus's capable but aging hands. The marriage alliance would bring not just bloodline continuation, but also a substantial dowry that could restore some of the manor's former glory. The supernatural world existed in careful balance with the mortal realm, hidden in plain sight through generations of careful manipulation and mutual benefit. Certain human families had served vampire houses for centuries, their discretion bought with protection, wealth, and the occasional gift of extended life. The blood pact system had evolved as a civilized alternative to the hunting and feeding practices of more primitive vampire clans, creating stable relationships that benefited both species. Alaric's own transformation had occurred nearly 500 years ago, when he was still young enough to believe in love, honor, and the possibility of happily ever after. The details remained painful even across centuries. A naive young lord who had fallen prey to a beautiful vampire courtier, only to discover that eternal life came with prices he hadn't imagined. His human family had aged and died while he remained unchanged. His mortal friends had turned to dust while his reflection vanished from mirrors. Love itself had become a casualty of immortality, as each relationship ended in the same inevitable loss. The weight of expectation pressed down like physical force. The ancestral portrait gallery reminded him daily of the lords who had come before, each having successfully continued the bloodline, each having contributed to the family legacy. His father, stern and proud, who had ruled the estate with an iron hand for over 3 centuries before finally succumbing to the madness. His grandfather, whose diplomatic skills had secured the family's position in vampire society. His great-grandfather, a warrior who had fought in the great clan wars that had shaped the modern supernatural world. What would they think of their descendant now? A recluse who preferred books to politics, solitude to social obligations, who had allowed the family fortune to dwindle and the estate to decay through simple neglect. The marriage represented his last chance to prove himself worthy of the Blackthorn name, to create something lasting rather than merely enduring. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, Alaric found himself examining his motivations with uncomfortable clarity. Was this truly about love, companionship, or even duty? Or was it simply another form of the same desperate loneliness that had driven him to increasingly elaborate schemes to feel something, anything, beyond the endless grey monotony of immortal existence? The sound of wheels on gravel drew his attention back to the window. A merchant's cart was making its way up the long drive, pulled by a sturdy horse whose breath formed small clouds in the cool air. The moment had arrived. His bride, his future, his last hope for redemption or damnation, approached through the lifting mist like a figure from a dream. Alaric straightened his cravat and checked his appearance in the non-reflective surface of a silver picture frame. Whatever came next would determine not just his fate, but the fate of everything he had built, everything his family had achieved, everything that might yet be saved from the slow decay of centuries. Marcus appeared at his elbow, silent as always until needed. "Shall I greet the lady at the door, my lord?" "No," Alaric replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "I'll receive her myself. It's time to see what 500 years of careful planning have delivered to my doorstep." The cart was drawing closer now, and with it, the future, whatever form it might take. The merchant's cart creaked to a halt before the manor's grand entrance, its wooden wheels settling into the worn grooves left by countless carriages over the centuries. Alaric positioned himself at the top of the stone steps, hands clasped behind his back in a pose that projected authority and control. The carefully rehearsed words of greeting died in his throat as the cart's passenger emerged. This was not Lady Catherine Whitmore, the pale, willowy maiden whose portrait had graced the correspondence. This was not the delicate flower bred in noble houses to serve as decorative wife and dutiful mother. The woman who stepped down from the cart with sure, practiced movements was substantial in every sense of the word, broad of shoulder, full of figure, with greying brown hair, pinned back in a practical style that spoke of work rather than leisure. Elspeth Hartwell moved with the confident gait of someone accustomed to being useful, her travelling dress of sturdy brown wool showing signs of long wear but careful mending. Her weathered leather bag, clutched in work-roughened hands, contained what appeared to be the entirety of her worldly possessions. She looked up at the imposing facade of Ravenshollow Manor with the appraising eye of someone calculating heating costs and structural repairs rather than admiring architectural beauty. "Lord Blackthorn, I presume?" Her voice carried the practical authority of a woman who had managed households and solved problems without fanfare. "I'm Elspeth Hartwell. The arrangements were made through Master Grimsby's agency, though I suspect there's been some manner of confusion." Alaric descended the steps with the fluid grace of a predator, his supernatural nature lending an otherworldly quality to movements that should have been merely aristocratic. "Indeed, there has been confusion, madam. You are not the bride I contracted for. Lady Catherine Whitmore was to arrive today, not—" He paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Not a middle-aged widow with no particular beauty and even less fortune?" Elspeth's tone held no bitterness, merely the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had long ago made peace with society's assessments. Master Grimsby was quite clear about the circumstances. Lady Catherine fled to a convent rather than honour the arrangement. I was offered her place, with full disclosure of the unusual nature of the household. The words hit Alaric like physical blows. His carefully planned future, the alliance that would secure his bloodline, the delicate maiden who would bear his children and ask no uncomfortable questions about his nocturnal habits, all of it crumbling before this forthright woman who seemed utterly immune to his intimidating presence. "This is unacceptable," he said, allowing a hint of supernatural menace to colour his voice. The temperature around them dropped perceptibly, and shadows seemed to deepen despite the bright morning sun. "I have contracts, agreements, expectations that must be met." Elsbeth regarded him with the same practical assessment she had given the manor. "Expectations have a way of disappointing us, my lord. The question is whether you'll spend your energy raging against reality or adapting to it." She gestured toward the estate with one capable hand. "This place has good bones, but it's crying out for proper care. When did someone last tend those gardens with any real attention? And the windows haven't been cleaned thoroughly in years." The casual deflection of his supernatural intimidation display was perhaps more shocking than outright fear would have been. Alaric had grown accustomed to the way mortals reacted to his true nature: terror, awe, or desperate attempts at seduction by those who found darkness alluring. Elsbeth's response suggested she found him about as threatening as an untidy parlour. "You presume to criticize my household management?" The ancient pride of centuries rose in his voice. "This estate has stood for over 400 years. And it'll stand for 400 more if someone starts taking proper care of it." Elsbeth replied calmly. "But standing and thriving aren't the same thing, are they?" She looked directly into his eyes, with the unsettling directness of someone accustomed to speaking truth, regardless of its welcome. "When did you last have a proper conversation with another soul? When did you last share a meal with someone who wasn't paid to be in your presence?" Marcus emerged from the manor, his expression carefully neutral, despite what must have been considerable surprise at the scene unfolding on his doorstep. "My lord, shall I have the lady's belongings brought inside?" "That won't be necessary," Alaric said sharply. "Arrangements will be made for Mrs. Hartwell's return journey." This was clearly an error. "Actually," Elsbeth interjected, "the journey took the better part of 3 days. My previous lodgings have been forfeited, and I was promised fair compensation regardless of the outcome. I'll not be turned away without proper consideration of the situation." The quiet steel in her voice carried more authority than any amount of supernatural posturing. Here was a woman who had clearly faced rejection and disappointment before, who had learned to stand her ground through necessity rather than privilege. "Very well," Alaric conceded through gritted teeth. "You may remain until tomorrow while arrangements are made. Marcus, see her to the Blue Chamber." "With respect, my lord," Marcus interrupted gently, "perhaps the Rose Chamber would be more suitable. It faces east and receives better morning light." The exchange revealed something that Alaric had been blind to. His servants were already responding to Elsbeth with the kind of consideration they usually reserved for family. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her thin face brightening at the sight of a woman in the house for the first time in decades. Young Tom emerged from the garden shed, straightening his back and smoothing his hair in the automatic response of a man to feminine presence. "Thank you," Elsbeth said to Marcus, then turned back to Alaric. "I'll need to see the household accounts if I'm to understand the full situation. And someone should check the roof over the east wing. There are water stains visible from here that suggest damage." "You'll do no such thing," Alaric snapped. "You are a guest here, nothing more. You have no authority over my household or my affairs." "Everyone needs something to do," Elsbeth replied, with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a stubborn child. "I don't sit idle well, and from what I can see, there's work enough here to keep an army busy. The casual assumption that she would simply insert herself into the running of his estate was breathtaking in its audacity. Yet, as Alaric watched her interact with his servants, he saw something he hadn't witnessed in decades: genuine warmth, the kind of natural authority that came from caring rather than commanding. Mrs. Hartwell approached with the shy eagerness of someone starved for female companionship. "If I may, miss, would you care for some refreshment after your journey? The morning room is quite pleasant this time of day." "That would be lovely," Elsbeth replied warmly. "And please, it's Elsbeth. I'd be grateful for the chance to rest these old bones and perhaps learn a bit about the household." As the women disappeared into the manor, chatting easily about practical matters, Alaric found himself standing alone on his own doorstep, his carefully ordered world tilting on its axis. The bride, who was supposed to secure his future, had been replaced by a woman who seemed intent on reorganizing his present. The delicate alliance he had planned was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by someone who treated his centuries of accumulated authority as merely another household problem to be solved. Marcus lingered nearby, his expression carefully diplomatic. "Shall I prepare the usual afternoon correspondence, my lord?" "Correspondence to whom?" Alaric asked bitterly. "To inform the Vampire Council that my carefully planned marriage alliance has been replaced by a middle-aged widow who thinks my estate needs better window cleaning. To explain that the heir they expect me to produce will now depend on a woman who seems more interested in household management than supernatural politics." Perhaps, Marcus suggested gently, "we might wait to see what develops. First impressions can be deceiving." Through the window, Alaric could see Elsbeth moving through his morning room with the unconscious efficiency of someone assessing and cataloguing. She paused to examine the condition of the draperies, tested the stability of a loose chair leg, and straightened a crooked painting with the automatic movements of someone who saw problems and solved them without fanfare. For 500 years, he had existed in careful isolation, managing his supernatural nature through control and distance. Now, a mortal woman who showed no fear of his darkness was calmly rearranging his life, as if his centuries of experience counted for nothing against her practical wisdom. The blood-packed scroll seemed to mock him from his desk, its crimson ribbon now looking less like tradition and more like the bindings of a trap he had built for himself. Everything he had planned, everything he had hoped for, lay in ruins before a woman who treated his immortal authority as nothing more than poor household management. Yet despite his fury, despite the collapse of his carefully laid plans, Alaric found himself curious about what Elsbeth Hartwell would do next. The Rose Chamber had not housed a guest in over 15 years, and despite Marcus's best efforts, it bore the telltale signs of neglect that seemed to permeate every corner of Ravenshollow Manor. Elsbeth set her worn leather bag on the faded coverlet and moved to the window, pushing back curtains that released small clouds of dust into the afternoon light. The view overlooked what had once been formal gardens, now overgrown with brambles and wild roses that climbed the stone walls in chaotic profusion. She had lived in enough temporary lodgings to recognize the difference between poverty and neglect. This was neglect the kind that came from loneliness rather than lack of means. The furniture was quality, built to last centuries, but it hadn't been properly cared for in decades. The Turkish carpet beneath her feet had once been magnificent, but now showed worn patches and faded colors that spoke of beauty slowly dying from inattention. Marcus appeared in the doorway with a hand-drawn map of the estate. His careful sketches revealing hidden passages and forgotten rooms that told the story of a once vibrant household. "Mrs. Hartwell thought you might appreciate understanding the layout," he said, spreading the parchment on the small writing desk. "The manor can be quite confusing to newcomers." "You drew this yourself," Elsbeth observed, noting the precise detail and careful annotations. "You know this place better than anyone, don't you?" "I've served the Blackthorn family for 40 years, Marcus replied, with quiet pride. "My father served before me, and his father before him. We've seen the estate in both its glory days and—" he gestured vaguely toward the window, "and its current state." Elsbeth finished gently. "Tell me about Lord Alaric. Not the master you serve, but the man you know him to be." Marcus hesitated, loyalty warring with honesty. "He wasn't always so withdrawn. When I first came here, he still entertained occasionally, still took interest in the estate's affairs, but each decade has seen him retreat further into himself. He reads constantly, corresponds with scholars across Europe, but he rarely ventures beyond these walls." "What changed him?" "Time," Marcus said simply. "Time changes everything, but for those who don't age, it becomes a burden rather than a gift. He's watched the world transform around him while remaining unchanged himself. It would drive anyone to despair." Elsbeth studied the map, noting the extensive grounds, the outbuildings, the careful notation of which rooms were no longer in use. "He's not the first lonely soul I've encountered. Men often think isolation protects them from hurt, but it only ensures they'll never heal from the wounds they already carry." A commotion in the courtyard drew her attention back to the window. Lord Alaric stood near the stables, his posture rigid, with barely contained frustration as he spoke with young Tom. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he maintained over whatever supernatural abilities he possessed. "I should go down," she murmured, then caught herself. This wasn't her household to manage, wasn't her place to smooth over conflicts between master and servant. Yet the automatic impulse to fix, to help, to make things better ran too deep in her nature to ignore completely. She made her way through the manor's corridors, following Marcus's map to avoid getting lost in the maze of unused rooms and covered furniture. The house felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, carefully preserved, but empty of the warmth that made a place truly alive. The kitchen proved to be the exception. Mrs. Hartwell moved between worn wooden counters with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had long ago claimed this space as her own domain. The hearth was properly tended, copper pots gleamed despite their age, and the aroma of baking bread filled the air with homely comfort. "I thought you might appreciate some tea," the cook said, her thin face brightening at the sight of female company. "And perhaps you could tell me, are you really here to marry his lordship?" "The arrangements seem to have gone somewhat awry," Elsbeth replied diplomatically, "though I suspect marriage to a man like Lord Alaric would be challenging under the best of circumstances." Mrs. Hartwell poured steaming tea into delicate china cups that had seen better days. "He's not cruel, mind you, just lost. Been that way for years now. We keep hoping something will bring him back to himself, but hope gets harder to maintain as time passes." "What was he like before?" "Kinder, more engaged with the world around him. He used to know all our names, ask after our families. Now he barely sees us most days, and when he does, it's like we're strangers who happen to live in his house." The tea was excellent, a blend that spoke of careful selection and proper preparation despite the household's obvious financial constraints. Elsbeth found herself genuinely curious about the man who inspired such loyalty in his servants, despite his apparent emotional absence. "The estate has good bones," she said, unconsciously echoing her earlier assessment. "But it needs more than maintenance. It needs purpose." "That's what we've been lacking, Mrs." Hartwell agreed, a sense that we're working towards something rather than just maintaining what's left of what was. Through the kitchen window, Elsbeth could see Alaric returning from the stables, his long coat billowing behind him in the afternoon breeze. He moved with fluid grace, but there was something predatory in his stride that reminded her this was no ordinary nobleman. The supernatural elements of the situation hadn't escaped her notice. She simply chose not to be intimidated by what she didn't fully understand. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said carefully, "what exactly do you know about your master's Unusual circumstances? The cook's hands stilled in their preparation of tomorrow's bread. We know what we need to know. That he's different, that his needs are different, that our discretion is both expected and appreciated. She met Elsbeth's eyes directly. Does that frighten you? I've lived long enough to learn that what people are matters less than how they choose to behave, Elsbeth replied. A cruel man is cruel, whether he's mortal or something else entirely. A lonely man is simply lonely, regardless of how long he's been alive. The sound of the front door opening and closing echoed through the manor, followed by footsteps that moved with supernatural silence across the stone floors. Alaric was returning to his study, to his solitude, to whatever brooding occupied his evening hours. He'll expect dinner to be served in his private dining room, Mrs. Hartwell said. He always dines alone. Not tonight, Elsbeth said quietly. Tonight he has a guest. The cook's eyebrows rose. He won't like that. He hasn't shared a meal with anyone in years. Then, perhaps it's time he remembered how. Elsbeth replied, her tone carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being right about such matters. We'll dine in the main dining room. Set 2 places. But the main dining room hasn't been used since someone decided it was easier to hide from the world than engage with it, Elsbeth finished. Well, I'm here now, and I don't believe in hiding. As she made her way back to her chamber to prepare for dinner, Elsbeth found herself genuinely intrigued by the challenge Lord Alaric presented. She had spent most of her adult life making do, adapting to circumstances, finding ways to be useful in situations that others might find impossible. This was simply another puzzle to solve, another household to understand, another lonely soul who had forgotten how to connect with the world around him. The difference was that this time she wouldn't be leaving when the immediate crisis passed. Whatever had brought her here, whatever mistake or deliberate mischief had led to her arrival, instead of Lady Catherine, she was here now. And Elsbeth Hartwell had never been one to waste an opportunity to make a difference, regardless of how unexpected the circumstances might be. The main dining room had once been the heart of social life at Ravenshollow Manor. Even now, shrouded in dust covers and neglect, the room's inherent grandeur was undeniable. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, capable of seating 20 guests with ease. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the coffered ceiling, their prisms catching the last rays of evening light that filtered through tall windows. Family portraits gazed down from the walls, generations of blackthorns presiding over countless dinner parties, political discussions, and celebrations that had shaped the local countryside for centuries. Elsbeth stood in the doorway, assessing the task before her. In the estate's neglected garden, she had discovered tools, so rusted they seemed beyond hope of restoration. Yet she had learned long ago that with patience and proper care, even the most damaged things could often be brought back to useful life. The garden tools had become her first project, their symbolic importance not lost on her. If you could nurture growth in seemingly barren soil, you could nurture hope in seemingly hopeless situations. Mrs. Hartwell appeared beside her, wringing her hands with nervous energy. Miss Elsbeth, I truly don't think this is wise. His lordship has very particular habits. He dines at sunset, alone, in his study. He's maintained this routine for decades. Habits can become prisons if we're not careful, Elsbeth replied, moving to one of the windows to examine the extent of grime accumulated on the glass. When did this room last host a proper dinner? Not since his lordship's father passed, nearly 30 years ago now. Lord Cornelius used to entertain frequently political gatherings, alliance meetings, with other noble houses. This room has seen prime ministers and foreign ambassadors, vampire lords from across Europe. The weight of history pressed down on them both. Elsbeth could almost hear the echoes of conversation and laughter that had once filled this space. could imagine the careful choreography of formal dinners where political futures were decided over multiple courses and carefully selected wines. "Then it's time this room remembered its purpose," she said firmly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'll need your help. We have perhaps 2 hours before dinner service." What followed was a whirlwind of activity that breathed life back into forgotten spaces. Young Tom was conscripted to help move furniture and beat dust from the heavy draperies. Mrs. Hartwell produced candles from storage, their warm light transforming the room from mausoleum to sanctuary. Marcus contributed his intimate knowledge of the house's resources, locating china, silverware, and crystal glasses that hadn't seen use in decades. As they worked, Elsbeth found herself genuinely impressed by the quality of everything around her. The neglect was superficial, underneath lay craftsmanship and materials that spoke of true wealth and refined taste. Lord Alaric's ancestors had built something meant to last, something worthy of restoration. "Tell me about the vampire politics Mrs. Hartwell mentioned," Elsbeth said as she polished wine glasses with careful attention. "These alliance meetings, they were important?" Marcus paused in his arrangement of silverware. Lord Alaric's father was deeply involved in supernatural governance. Vampire society has its own hierarchies, its own rules and traditions. Marriages between houses consolidate power, establish territories, ensure bloodline continuation. And now Lord Alaric faces pressure to marry for similar reasons? "The expectation has only grown stronger with time," Marcus admitted. "He's the last of his line. Without an heir, the Blackthorn holdings would revert to the Vampire Council, likely be parcelled out among more politically active houses." The implications were staggering. This wasn't simply about a lonely man's desire for companionship. Entire legacies hung in the balance, political structures that had maintained stability in the supernatural world for centuries. "No wonder he seemed so burdened," Elsbeth murmured. "The weight of all that history, all those expectations." As sunset approached, they heard the familiar sound of Lord Alaric's footsteps descending the main staircase. His routine was so established that they could predict his movements, to the minute study, to dining room, to library, to private chambers, a circuit that varied only on the nights when he ventured out for reasons he never discussed with his household staff. The footsteps paused outside the main dining room, and Elsbeth could imagine his surprise at seeing light spilling beneath the closed doors. When he entered, his expression shifted through a complex sequence of emotions: surprise, irritation, something that might have been vulnerability quickly masked by aristocratic hauteur. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of centuries. "Dinner," Elsbeth replied simply, rising from her seat at the foot of the great table. She had chosen the position deliberately close enough for conversation, far enough to avoid seeming presumptuous about hierarchy. Alaric's gaze swept the transformed room, taking in the gleaming crystal, the warm candlelight, the careful attention to detail that had restored the space to its former elegance. "I dine alone. I have made this preference quite clear." "You dine alone because you've chosen to," Elsbeth corrected gently. "Tonight, you have a guest. Surely basic courtesy suggests you might adjust your habits accordingly." The challenge was delivered without aggression, but its impact was nonetheless profound. Here was a woman who refused to be intimidated by his supernatural nature, who treated his centuries of accumulated authority as merely another household management issue to be resolved through practical application of common sense. "Mrs. Hartwell has prepared something special," Elsbeth continued, settling back into her chair with the calm confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. It would be a shame to let her efforts go to waste. For a moment, Alaric seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond. His supernatural senses would tell him that this was merely a mortal woman, possessed of no special powers or abilities beyond the unsettling capacity to remain utterly unimpressed by displays of otherworldly authority. Yet something in her steady gaze suggested depths he hadn't yet fathomed. He took his seat at the head of the table with the fluid grace that marked all his movements, though Elsbeth noticed tension in his shoulders that spoke of discomfort with the social interaction. "You presume a great deal," he said, as Mrs. Hartwell appeared with the first course, a delicate soup that filled the room with the aroma of herbs and perfectly balanced seasoning. "I presume that underneath all that brooding authority lies a man who's forgotten how pleasant conversation can be," Elsbeth replied, tasting the soup with obvious appreciation. "Mrs. Hartwell is an excellent cook. You're fortunate to have her. Fortune has little to do with it. She serves because her family has always served mine. Service motivated by tradition is different from service motivated by affection," Elsbeth observed. "Your staff care for you genuinely. That's not something to take lightly." The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in the manor for decades. Elsbeth asked questions about the estate's history, about the portraits looking down at them, about the careful craftsmanship evident in every detail of the room's construction. She listened to his answers with genuine interest, offering observations that revealed both practical wisdom and unexpected insight into human nature. Despite himself, Alaric found his carefully maintained emotional distance beginning to erode. This woman's complete lack of fear or deference was simultaneously infuriating and refreshing. She treated him as simply another person worth knowing, another puzzle worth understanding, another soul worth reaching. 3 days after Elsbeth's arrival, the routine of Ravenshollow Manor had begun to shift in ways both subtle and profound. The change was most evident in the servant's demeanour. Mrs. Hartwell hummed while cooking, young Tom stood straighter when tending the grounds, and Marcus moved through his duties with renewed purpose. Even the manor itself seemed to respond to the feminine presence, rooms that had felt cold and lifeless, now warming under the influence of someone who saw potential rather than decay. Alaric found himself increasingly drawn to observe these transformations, though he maintained careful distance. From his study window, he watched Elsbeth work in the garden, her practical approach to restoration, revealing both the scope of neglect and the possibility of renewal. She didn't simply pull weeds, she studied the underlying structure, identified which plants could be saved and which needed complete replacement, approached the work with the methodical patience of someone who understood that lasting change required thoughtful planning. The family crypt's empty tomb had been prepared for his eventual rest decades ago, a marble sarcophagus that awaited the day when immortal existence became unbearable. He had commissioned it during one of his darker periods, when the weight of centuries had pressed down with crushing force. Now, watching Elsbeth breathe life back into his neglected estate, the tomb seemed less like inevitable destiny and more like surrender to despair. The morning brought an unwelcome disruption to these newfound rhythms. Marcus interred the study with obvious reluctance, carrying correspondence that bore the unmistakable seal of House Ravencrest. "Lady Morgana has announced her intention to visit," Marcus said, his tone carefully neutral. "She arrives this afternoon with a small retinue, ostensibly to offer congratulations on your engagement." Alaric's blood ran cold. Lady Morgana Ravencrest was perhaps the most formidable political force in European vampire society, a woman who had survived 5 centuries through a combination of ruthless intelligence, supernatural power, and an ability to manipulate both mortal and immortal politics with equal skill. Her interest in his marriage arrangements could only mean trouble. "She knows," he said flatly. "Somehow she's learned that Lady Catherine failed to arrive." "It would appear so, my lord. Her message suggests she's quite curious about your alternative arrangements." The implications were staggering. Lady Morgana represented not just her own considerable power, but also the interests of the Vampire Council, those ancient lords who maintained order within supernatural society. If she had come to investigate the status of his marriage alliance, it meant his personal affairs had become matters of political significance. "Where is Mrs. Hartwell?" Alaric asked, sudden protective instincts surprising him with their intensity. "In the morning room, reviewing household accounts at her own insistence," Marcus replied. "She's identified several areas where economies might be achieved without compromising the estate's basic functions." Of course she had. Elsbeth's practical nature would naturally lead her to understand the household's financial pressures, just as her caring nature would drive her to seek solutions rather than simply accepting problems as inevitable. "She cannot meet Lady Morgana," Alaric said firmly. The political complexities alone Morgana would see Elsbeth as either threat or opportunity, and neither assessment would end. "Well, with respect, my lord, Mrs. Hartwell is not easily hidden. She's made herself quite integral to the household's daily operations in just 3 days. Lady Morgana will certainly notice her presence." The sound of laughter drifted up from the garden's genuine, warm-hearted amusement that had been absent from the manor for so long that Alaric had forgotten how it sounded. Through the window, he could see Elsbeth speaking with young Tom. Her animated gestures and obvious enjoyment of their conversation creating a scene of domestic harmony that felt almost alien in its normality. How could he explain to Lady Morgana that his carefully planned political marriage had been replaced by whatever this was? That the woman who was supposed to secure his bloodline and advance his house's interests was instead a middle-aged widow who seemed more concerned with proper household management than supernatural politics. Yet, as he watched Elsbeth, Alaric found himself reluctant to dismiss her presence as simply unfortunate circumstance. In 3 days, she had accomplished what decades of his own efforts had failed to achieve. She had made Ravenshallow Manor feel like a home rather than a mausoleum. The afternoon brought Lady Morgana's arrival in characteristic style. Her carriage was a masterwork of Gothic elegance, pulled by horses whose midnight black coats gleamed like polished obsidian. She emerged from the vehicle with the fluid grace of a natural predator, her pale beauty unmarked by the centuries she had lived, her dark hair arranged in elaborate styles that had been fashionable when she was mortal, but now seemed timelessly elegant. Her retinue was small but significant, 2 other vampire nobles whose presence indicated this was no casual social call. Lord Ashford represented the old guard, traditionalists who viewed any deviation from established customs as dangerous innovation. Lady Seraphina was younger in vampire terms, but had already established herself as a rising power in continental politics. "Alaric," Lady Morgana said, her voice carrying the musical quality that marked vampires of her age and power. "How lovely to see you looking so well, and how fascinating to hear about your recent developments." The greeting was delivered with perfect aristocratic courtesy, but Alaric caught the subtle emphasis that indicated she knew far more about his situation than her message had suggested. Her pale green eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the manor's exterior, noting both its grandeur and its obvious need for substantial investment. "Lady Morgana," he replied with equal formality, "to what do I owe the pleasure of this unexpected visit?" "Unexpected? Surely the announcement of your engagement merits congratulations from your oldest friends." Her smile was sharp as winter starlight, "though I confess myself curious about your choice of bride. Lady Catherine Whitmore's reputation precedes her, of course, but recent information suggests she may not have proven suitable to your requirements." The conversation was conducted in the elaborate verbal fencing that characterized vampire high society, where direct questions were considered vulgar and information was extracted through implication and careful observation. Alaric found himself at a distinct disadvantage. Lady Morgana clearly possessed intelligence about his situation that he couldn't match. "Circumstances evolved," he said carefully. Arrangements have been modified." to better serve all parties involved. How delightfully vague, Lady Morgana replied. Perhaps you might introduce me to your mysterious bride. I find myself quite eager to meet the woman who has captured the attention of the rather reclusive Lord Blackthorn. Before Alaric could respond, the sound of the front door opening announced someone's arrival. Elsbeth's voice carried clearly through the entrance hall as she spoke with Marcus about dinner preparations, her practical tone and obvious authority, marking her as someone completely comfortable managing household affairs. Lady Morgana's eyebrows rose with delicate precision. How intriguing! That doesn't sound like the voice of a gently bred noble maiden. The moment Alaric had dreaded was upon them, and he found himself caught between protecting Elsbeth from political forces she couldn't understand and maintaining the facade that might preserve his own position within vampire society. The formal introduction took place in the restored main dining room, where Elsbeth's practical improvements had transformed the space into something worthy of receiving distinguished guests. Candlelight warmed the mahogany surfaces, and crystal gleamed despite its age. But the true test lay not in the room's appearance, but in the collision of two utterly different worlds. Elsbeth entered with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to new situations and challenging personalities. She had changed into her best. Dress still practical brown wool, but well-tailored and carefully maintained. Her greying hair was neatly arranged, and her weathered hands moved with unconscious grace as she smoothed her skirts. She looked exactly like what she was, a respectable widow of modest means who had learned to navigate life's complexities through practical wisdom rather than inherited privilege. Lady Morgana assessed her with the calculating precision of a predator evaluating potential prey. The vampire noble's supernatural beauty made her appear carved from marble and starlight, her pale skin unmarked by time, her dark hair elaborately dressed in styles that spoke of wealth and leisure. Yet her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience, political maneuvering, and carefully controlled power. "Lady Morgana," Alaric said, his voice carefully neutral, "may I present Mrs. Elsbeth Hartwell, my intended bride." The pause before intended bride was slight but noticeable, and Lady Morgana's smile sharpened with genuine amusement. "Mrs. Hartwell, how delightfully unexpected." "Lady Morgana," Elsbeth replied with a respectful curtsy that was neither too deep nor too shallow, "Lord Alaric has spoken of your long-standing friendship. I'm honored to make your acquaintance." The exchange was perfectly polite on the surface, but Alaric could sense the undercurrents of evaluation flowing between the two women. Lady Morgana was accustomed to being the most formidable presence in any room, while Elsbeth possessed the kind of steady authority that came from managing difficult situations with limited resources. In her modest room upstairs, Elsbeth had been collecting handwritten recipes, practical dishes that transformed basic ingredients into nourishing meals. The leather-bound book had become her tool for understanding the household's needs and capabilities, but it also represented something more profound, her ability to create warmth and comfort in any circumstance. Now, watching her face Lady Morgana's subtle interrogation, those same qualities were being tested on an entirely different stage. "Tell me, Mrs. Hartwell," Lady Morgana said, settling into her chair with predatory grace, "how are you finding life at Ravenshollow Manor? I imagine the adjustment must be quite significant." "Every household has its own rhythms," Elsbeth replied diplomatically. "I've found the staff to be exceptionally capable and dedicated. The estate itself has remarkable potential." "Potential," Lady Morgana repeated, as if tasting the word. "How refreshingly optimistic. And tell me, what do you make of our dear Alaric's rather unique circumstances?" The question was designed to force Elsbeth into either revealing dangerous ignorance about vampire society or demonstrating knowledge that would raise uncomfortable questions about how she had acquired it. I've learned that every person carries burdens that may not be immediately apparent, Elspeth said carefully. Lord Alaric is clearly a man of depth and complexity. I find that admirable rather than troubling. Lord Ashford leaned forward with obvious interest. And the political implications of this union? Surely you understand the broader significance of alliance marriages in our community? Alaric tensed, recognizing the deliberate pressure being applied. These were waters that could drown someone unprepared for the currents of supernatural politics. I understand that marriage is both personal and political, Elsbeth replied with calm dignity. But I've always believed that relationships built on mutual respect and genuine caring prove more durable than those based solely on political convenience. Lady Seraphina exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Morgana. How charmingly idealistic, though I wonder if idealism serves well in situations requiring more practical considerations. In my experience, Elsbeth said, the most practical approach to any relationship is honesty about one's limitations and genuine commitment to the other person's well-being. Political considerations matter, certainly, but they shouldn't overshadow basic human decency. The conversation continued through dinner, each course bringing new, subtle challenges and careful probes. Elsbeth navigated the treacherous waters with instinctive skill, never claiming knowledge she didn't possess, but also never backing down from her core convictions about decency, honesty, and the importance of treating others with respect. Alaric watched with growing amazement as this woman who had arrived by accident proved more than capable of holding her own against some of the most sophisticated political minds in vampire society. She didn't try to match their supernatural advantages or pretend to understand their complex hierarchies. Instead, she remained steadfastly herself, practical, honest, and utterly unintimidated by displays of otherworldly power. After dinner, as the guests retired to the library for brandy and more serious discussion, Lady Morgana maneuvered to speak privately with Alaric. "She's extraordinary," the ancient vampire said without preamble. "Completely unsuitable by traditional standards, of course, but extraordinary nonetheless." "I'm aware of the unsuitability," Alaric replied stiffly. "Are you? Because from where I sit, she's handled herself with more grace and intelligence than half the noble-born brides I've seen presented to vampire society. The question is whether you're wise enough to recognize what you've stumbled into." The observation hit with unexpected force. Alaric had been so focused on what Elsbeth wasn't: young, beautiful, politically connected, bred for supernatural society, that he had perhaps failed to fully appreciate what she was. "The Council won't approve," he said. "The Council will approve whatever serves the greater stability of our society," Lady Morgana replied pragmatically. "Your house needs an heir. Your estate needs management. Your bloodline needs continuation. This woman might accomplish all three more effectively than any delicate flower raised in noble houses and trained to be decorative rather than functional." As the evening progressed, it became clear that Elsbeth's presence was creating ripples throughout the supernatural community's expectations. Her refusal to be cowed by displays of otherworldly power, combined with her obvious intelligence and practical competence, was forcing a re-evaluation of what made a suitable vampire bride. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw her, but in how Alaric saw himself reflected in her steady gaze. For centuries, he had defined himself primarily through his supernatural nature, his ancient bloodline, his political obligations. Elsbeth looked at him and saw something simpler and more complex. A man capable of growth, change, and genuine connection. When the guests finally departed with promises to report favorable impressions to the Vampire Council, Alaric found himself alone with Elsbeth in the candlelit dining room. The evening had been a trial by fire, and she had emerged not just unscathed, but somehow enhanced by the experience. "That was quite an ordeal," he said. That was quite an education, she corrected gently. Your world is more complex than I understood, but complexity doesn't have to mean impossibility. In that moment, Alaric realized that his carefully planned political marriage had indeed been replaced by something unexpected, not disaster, but possibility. The discovery came by accident, as the most profound revelations often do. Elsbeth had been exploring the manor's unused east wing, armed with Marcus's detailed maps and a practical desire to understand the full scope of the property she was apparently meant to help manage. The section had been closed off for decades, its rooms shrouded in dust covers and sealed against the elements, but structural concerns had drawn her attention to water damage that might threaten the building's foundation. Behind a bookshelf in what had once been a lady's sitting room, she found a narrow door that Marcus's careful sketches had somehow missed. The hidden chamber beyond was small but clearly important, its walls lined with ancient texts and documents that spoke of centuries of careful record-keeping. The air itself felt different here, not musty with neglect, but charged with the weight of accumulated secrets. The ancient bloodline chronicle lay open on a reading table, as if someone had been interrupted in the middle of research. The leather-bound manuscript was clearly very old, its pages filled with carefully illuminated text in languages that shifted between Latin, Old English, and symbols that seemed to predate both. Elsbeth's education had been practical rather than scholarly, but years of managing household accounts had taught her to recognize important documents even when she couldn't fully understand their contents. What she could understand, however, made her blood run cold. The name Hartwell appeared repeatedly throughout the chronicle, linked to bloodlines and genealogies that traced back through centuries of carefully maintained records. Her grandmother's maiden name Blackwood appeared even more frequently, connected to charts and diagrams that mapped supernatural heritage through generation after generation of apparently human families. As she studied the pages with growing amazement and horror, the truth began to emerge like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Her grandmother, the quiet woman who had raised her with practical wisdom and gentle strength, had carried vampire blood. Not active, not manifested, but present nonetheless a dormant heritage that could be awakened under the right circumstances. The original blood pact, she realized with mounting shock, hadn't been seeking any noble maiden at all. It had been specifically designed to locate and unite this lost bloodline with the Blackthorn house. The careful negotiations, the political considerations, the elaborate arrangements, all of it had been orchestrated to bring her, specifically her, to this place at this time. Master Grimsby hadn't made a mistake when he sent her instead of Lady Catherine. He had known exactly what he was doing. Footsteps in the corridor announced someone's approach, and Elsbeth quickly gathered the most relevant pages, her mind racing with implications she was only beginning to understand. When Alaric appeared in the doorway, his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as he took in the hidden chamber and the documents spread across the reading table. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his tone carried more concern than anger. "These records contain information that could be dangerous in the wrong hands." "They contain information about me," Elsbeth replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "About my family, my heritage, things I was never told." She held up one of the pages, its illuminated text clearly showing her grandmother's lineage. "My grandmother was a Blackwood, the Blackwood vampire line that was supposed to have died out 3 centuries ago." Alaric's supernatural stillness was more telling than any dramatic reaction could have been. He moved to the table with careful precision, his pale eyes scanning the documents she had uncovered. "You weren't supposed to find this. No one was supposed to find this. But you knew," she said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "You knew what I was when I arrived. That's why you didn't send me away immediately, why you allowed me to stay despite your obvious preference for solitude. I suspected." Alaric admitted quietly. Your reaction to my supernatural nature, your complete lack of fear, it suggested either extraordinary courage or inherited familiarity. When I investigated Master Grimsby's records more thoroughly, certain discrepancies became apparent. The betrayal cut deeper than she had expected. So this was all manipulation, the marriage arrangement, my presence here, everything. It was orchestrated to serve some political purpose I don't understand. The blood pact was created by my ancestors specifically to locate surviving members of the Blackwood line. Alaric explained, his voice careful and measured. Your family's supernatural heritage was deliberately hidden, passed down through the female line, and kept dormant to protect them from vampire politics. But the potential for awakening always remained. Elsbeth sank into the reading chair, the weight of revelation pressing down like physical force. Everything she had believed about herself, her family, her place in the world, all of it had been built on carefully maintained deceptions. She wasn't the practical widow who had stumbled into an impossible situation. She was the culmination of centuries of planning, bred and positioned to serve purposes she had never imagined. What does this mean? She asked. For me, for us, for whatever this relationship was becoming, it means, Alaric said carefully, that our union would restore an ancient alliance that was broken when the Blackwood line was thought to have ended. It means that any children we might have would carry both bloodlines, making them extraordinarily powerful within vampire society. It means that, instead of being politically unsuitable, you are perhaps the most suitable bride I could possibly have found. The irony was bitter and overwhelming. She had spent her entire adult life being deemed not enough, not beautiful enough, not young enough, not wealthy enough, not fertile enough to merit serious consideration from any man of substance. Now she discovered that she was not just enough, but too much, too valuable, too important to be allowed simple human choice in her own fate. And if I choose to leave, she asked, if I decide that I want no part of vampire, politics, or supernatural heritage, or ancient blood pacts, Alaric's expression grew pained. That choice may no longer be entirely yours to make. Knowledge of your heritage changes everything. There are factions within vampire society who would kill to prevent this alliance, and others who would kill to control it. Your safety may now depend on accepting the protection that marriage to me would provide. The sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor interrupted their conversation. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor shattered by obvious urgency. My lord, he said breathlessly, riders approach. Multiple parties, coming from different directions. I fear word of tonight's discoveries has somehow reached interested parties far more quickly than we anticipated. Through the chamber's single window, Elsbeth could see torches moving through the darkness like malevolent stars. The supernatural world that had seemed merely complex a few hours ago was revealing itself to be actively dangerous, and she was apparently at the center of conflicts she had never imagined existed. How many? Alaric asked, his voice taking on the cold authority of someone accustomed to warfare. At least 2 distinct groups, possibly 3. Some flying the banners of House Ravencrest, others bearing symbols I don't recognize. They'll reach the manor within minutes. The transformation in Alaric was immediate and startling. The brooding, isolated nobleman vanished, replaced by someone whose supernatural nature carried undertones of predatory readiness. This was what 5 centuries of survival had created, not just a reclusive scholar, but a warrior capable of protecting what he valued. Elsbeth, he said, turning to her with intensity that made the air itself feel charged, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens in the next few hours, whatever choices you make about your future, I want you to know that what has grown between us wasn't part of any political calculation. Your heritage explains why you were brought here, but it doesn't explain why I've come to care for you. The confession delivered in the shadow of approaching danger, carried weight that formal declarations in safer circumstances could never have matched. Here was truth spoken when truth mattered most, when pretense and political considerations fell away before immediate peril. Outside, the torches were converging on Ravenshollow Manor like wolves circling prey, and Elsbeth realized that her quiet life of practical obscurity was ending forever. Whatever emerged from this night would transform not just her understanding of herself, but her place in a world far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The ancient bloodline that had been hidden for her protection was about to become either her salvation or her doom, and the choice of which might no longer be entirely hers to make. The great hall of Ravenshollow Manor had been transformed into something resembling a war council within the span of an hour. Maps of the estate were spread across the massive oak table, candles flickered in iron sconces that hadn't been lit in decades, and the assembled group represented an unlikely alliance born of immediate necessity rather than political calculation. Marcus had proven invaluable in identifying the approaching factions through careful observation and decades of experience in supernatural politics. Lady Morgana had returned with remarkable speed once word reached her of the evening's discoveries, her earlier diplomatic courtesy replaced by the sharp focus of someone who understood the stakes involved. Most surprisingly, Mrs. Hartwell and young Tom had been armed with ancient weapons from the manor's armory, their loyalty to the household overriding any sensible fear of supernatural warfare. In the center of it all stood the binding ceremony chalice, an ornate silver goblet that had been retrieved from the family vault along with other ceremonial artifacts. Its intricate engravings depicted scenes of vampire history, alliances forged and broken, bloodlines united and severed, the eternal dance of power that had shaped supernatural society for millennia. The chalice represented both tradition and transformation, the weight of the past and the possibility of an unprecedented future. Elsbeth found herself caught between terror and fascination as she struggled to understand the rapid developments that had overtaken her quiet existence. The supernatural abilities that had supposedly laid dormant in her blood were beginning to manifest under the extreme stress of the situation. She could sense the approaching riders with unnatural clarity, could feel the emotional undercurrents flowing between the manor's defenders, could perceive dangers that her human senses should have been unable to detect. The eastern approach is blocked by Lord Ashford's forces, Lady Morgana reported, her pale fingers tracing routes on Marcus's detailed maps. They're not here to prevent the alliance, they want to control it. Ashford represents the old guard, who believe they can manage this situation to their advantage. And the western riders? Alaric asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. Unknown, but their supernatural signatures suggest considerable power. Either very old vampires or something else entirely. Lady Morgana's expression grew grim. There are rumors of other supernatural factions taking interest in bloodline politics, werewolf clans, ancient mage families, entities that have remained neutral for centuries. The political implications were staggering. Elsbeth's heritage apparently represented more than just vampire alliances. It was a catalyst that could reshape the entire supernatural world's balance of power. The quiet widow who had arrived by merchant's cart had become the focal point of conflicts that could affect beings across multiple species and continents. I need to understand what's happening to me, Elsbeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. These abilities, they're growing stronger by the hour. I can hear heartbeats from across the manor, sense emotions, perceive things that should be impossible. Alaric moved to her side with protective instincts that surprised them both. Vampire heritage awakens in response to strong emotion or mortal danger. The process can be overwhelming, but it also grants considerable power to those who learn to control it. Control it how? She asked, acutely aware that whatever was happening to her was accelerating beyond her ability to manage through practical wisdom alone. Feel, rather than think, Lady Morgana advised, with unexpected gentleness. Your human nature has been shaped by logic and practicality, but vampire abilities respond to instinct and emotional truth. Trust what your senses tell you, even when it contradicts what your mind believes possible. The training that followed was unlike anything Elsbeth had ever experienced. Under Lady Morgana's expert guidance, she learned to extend her supernatural senses throughout the manor and beyond, mapping the positions of friend and foe through awareness that transcended normal human perception. The process was exhausting and exhilarating, revealing capabilities she had never imagined while demanding a fundamental shift in how she understood reality. Alaric watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. The woman who had arrived as his unwanted bride was revealing depths of power that could make her one of the most formidable individuals in vampire society. Yet with each manifestation of supernatural ability, she moved further from the simple humanity that had first drawn him to her. "Are you afraid?" he asked, during a brief respite in their preparations. "Terrified," she admitted honestly, "but also alive in ways I've never been before. These abilities, this power, it's like discovering I've been living my entire life with only half my senses." The honesty of her response touched something deep within his centuries-hardened heart. Here was someone embracing transformation rather than fleeing from it, meeting impossible circumstances with the same practical courage she had applied to household management and garden restoration. As midnight approached, the formal preparations for the binding ceremony began, despite the approaching dangers. The ritual itself was both protection and declaration. Once completed, their union would be recognized throughout supernatural society, making any attempt to prevent it an act of war against established tradition. The ceremony would also complete Elsbeth's transformation, awakening her full vampire heritage and granting her the power necessary to defend herself against those who would use her for political gain. The great hall was prepared according to ancient customs, with circles of salt and silver, candles arranged in patterns that had been used for vampire bindings since before recorded history. The ceremonial robes, retrieved from storage that hadn't been disturbed in over a century, carried the weight of tradition and the promise of futures that stretched beyond mortal understanding. Missus, Hartwell and Marcus worked alongside Lady Morgana in preparing the ritual elements, their human service to the vampire house, creating bridges between worlds that had remained largely separate for generations. Young Tom stood guard with weapons he was only beginning to understand, his loyalty to Elsbeth transcending species boundaries and supernatural politics. The binding must be completed before dawn, Lady Morgana explained, as she arranged the ceremonial elements with practiced precision. Vampire ceremonies draw power from darkness, and the sunrise will break whatever protections we can establish tonight. "And if we're interrupted?" Elsbeth asked, acutely aware of the riders who continued to converge on the manor from multiple directions. "Then we fight," Alaric replied simply. "The ceremony, once begun, cannot be stopped without destroying both participants. Those who would prevent our union will have to go through us to do it." The weight of what they were undertaking settled over Elsbeth like a physical force. This wasn't simply marriage, it was transformation, alliance, revolution. She would emerge from tonight either as a fully awakened vampire with power sufficient to reshape supernatural society, or she wouldn't emerge at all. "I need you to know," she said to Alaric as they prepared for the ceremony that would bind their fates together, "that whatever brought me here originally, I choose this now. Not because of bloodlines or politics or ancient pacts, but because you've shown me what it means to build something meaningful with another person." The confession carried weight that formal vows could never match. Here was choice freely, made in the face of impossible circumstances, love declared when political convenience would have been sufficient, humanity embraced even as transformation beckoned. As they took their positions within the ceremonial circle, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by supernatural energies that made the air itself feel charged with danger and possibility. The binding ceremony would either secure their future together or provide the stage for their destruction, and the choice between those outcomes would be determined by forces beyond their control. The chalice gleamed in the candlelight, its ancient silver reflecting not just their faces, but the faces of all who had come before, all who had chosen love over political expedience, all who had believed that transformation was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Outside, the riders reached the manor's gates, their torches creating a ring of light that surrounded Ravenshollow like a siege. Inside, two souls, prepared to bind their fates together, regardless of the consequences, choosing each other in defiance of those who would make such choices for them. The ceremony was about to begin, and with it, a transformation that would change not just their lives, but the supernatural world itself. The binding ceremony began at the stroke of midnight, precisely as ancient tradition demanded. Alaric and Elspeth stood within the circle of salt and silver, their hands joined over the ornate chalice as Lady Morgana spoke the ritual words that had united vampire houses for over 1,000 years. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural energy as forces older than nations responded to the invocation. The blood moon pendant, retrieved from the family vault, along with other ceremonial artifacts, hung around Elspeth's neck like a talisman of transformation. The mystical amulet had been crafted centuries ago to channel the ancient magic that validated vampire unions, its dark stone pulsing with inner light that grew brighter as the ceremony progressed. When the pendant began to glow with ethereal fire, it would signal that their union had been blessed by powers beyond mortal understanding. By blood and shadow, by moon and starlight, let these souls be joined across the boundaries of mortal time, Lady Morgana intoned, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. What is bound in darkness shall endure beyond dawn. What is sealed in love shall transcend death itself. As the ritual words washed over them, Elspeth felt her dormant vampire heritage responding with increasing intensity. Power flowed through her veins like molten silver, awakening senses and abilities that had lay buried in her bloodline for generations. She could perceive the emotional resonance between herself and Alaric, could feel the ancient magic, recognizing their genuine connection and responding with approval that manifested as warmth and light throughout the great hall. The first interruption came just as they reached the midpoint of the ceremony. The manor's great doors burst open with supernatural force, admitting a rush of cold air and darker energies. Lord Ashford strode into the hall, flanked by armed vampires, whose expressions spoke of grim determination rather than diplomatic negotiation. His pale eyes swept the ceremonial scene with obvious displeasure. "This mockery ends now," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "The Blackthorn bloodline will not be contaminated by peasant heritage, regardless of whatever dubious supernatural claims have been fabricated." Lady Morgana never paused in her recitation of the binding words, but her free hand moved to weapons concealed within her ceremonial robes. The interruption had been anticipated, planned for, yet still carried the shock of violence intruding on sacred ritual. "The ceremony cannot be stopped once begun," Alaric said, his voice steady despite the obvious threat. "Ancient law protects vampire bindings from interference, even by the council itself." "Ancient law assumes legitimate participants," Ashford replied coldly. "This woman's supposed heritage is nothing but convenient fiction designed to legitimize an unsuitable alliance. I have evidence that her bloodline documentation has been falsified." The accusation hit like a physical blow, calling into question not just Elspeth's supernatural ancestry, but the entire foundation upon which their union rested. Yet even as doubt crept into her mind, the blood moon pendant continued to glow with increasing intensity, its mystical light responding to something deeper than genealogical records. The battle erupted with supernatural swiftness. Ashford's companions moved with the fluid grace of experienced vampire warriors, their enhanced speed and strength turning the great hall into a whirlwind of violence. Lady Morgana abandoned the ceremonial words to defend the ritual circle, her own considerable powers manifesting as shadows that moved independently of their sources. Elsbeth found herself thrust into combat for which no amount of practical experience had prepared her. Yet her awakening vampire abilities responded to the immediate danger with instinctive precision. She could anticipate her opponent's movements, could perceive weaknesses in their attacks, could channel power she was only beginning to understand into defensive capabilities that surprised everyone present. The pendant blazed like a captured star against her throat, its light growing so intense that it illuminated the entire hall with supernatural radiance. The ancient magic it channeled was responding not to bloodline purity or political calculations, but to the genuine love and commitment that flowed between her and Alaric, despite the chaos surrounding them. "The pendant validates what documents cannot prove," Lady Morgana called out as she fought off two attackers simultaneously. "Ancient magic recognizes truth that mortal politics would deny." Young Tom and Mrs. Hartwell had positioned themselves near the ceremonial circle, their human courage providing protection that their lack of supernatural abilities couldn't match. Marcus coordinated their defense with the tactical skill of someone who had survived decades in vampire society, his knowledge of the manor's layout proving invaluable in the close-quarters combat. As the battle raged around them, Alaric and Elsbeth maintained their positions within the ritual circle, their joined hands steady despite the violence threatening to overwhelm their protectors. The ceremony's completion depended not just on speaking the proper words, but on maintaining the emotional and spiritual connection that gave those words meaning. "Whatever happens," Alaric said as supernatural forces clashed around them, "know that choosing you was the first truly free decision I've made in centuries." The pendant's light reached crescendo intensity, bathing the great hall in radiance that made further combat impossible. Ancient magic had made its judgment, validating their union through power that transcended political manipulation and genealogical documentation. Yet even as victory seemed within reach, the sound of approaching reinforcements echoed through the night, suggesting that the battle for their future had only just begun. The reinforcements that poured through the manor's shattered doors were not what anyone had expected. Instead of additional forces loyal to Lord Ashford, a diverse coalition of supernatural beings entered the great hall with weapons drawn, but purposes that seemed more protective than destructive. Werewolf clan leaders stood alongside ancient mage families, their traditional rivalries temporarily set aside in the face of something more significant than political convenience. At their head walked a figure that made even Lady Morgana pause in her defensive preparations. Elena Nightwhisper was older than recorded vampire history, her presence carrying the weight of millennia and power that transcended normal supernatural hierarchies. Her pale hair gleamed like moonlight, and her ancient eyes held depths that spoke of secrets predating human civilization itself. "The binding will proceed," she declared in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Ancient magic has made its judgment, and those who would oppose it stand against powers older than their political ambitions." Lord Ashford's confident aggression faltered as he recognized both the newcomer and the implications of her intervention. Elena Nightwhisper answered to no council, acknowledged no political authority, served only the fundamental forces that maintained balance within the supernatural world. "This woman's heritage remains unproven," Ashford insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Political expedients cannot be allowed to override careful bloodline verification. Her heritage has been proven by magic that cannot be deceived or manipulated." Elena replied, gesturing toward the blood moon pendant that continued to blaze with supernatural radiance. The ancient artifacts respond only to genuine supernatural ancestry activated by authentic love. The renewed ancestral seal began to manifest above the ceremonial circle, its magical symbols shifting and evolving as the binding ceremony reached completion. The family crest that had adorned Blackthorn heraldry for centuries was transforming from representations of isolation and individual power into symbols of unity, partnership, and shared strength. Elsbeth watched in amazement as her own family's symbols began appearing within the evolving seal. The oak tree of endurance, the hearth fire of home, the intertwined roses that spoke of love growing from practical foundations. The magical display was rewriting history in real time, acknowledging not just the political significance of their union, but its deeper meaning for both families and the supernatural world itself. The combined powers that Elsbeth and Alaric generated together created unprecedented magical resonance throughout the Great Hall. Their joined abilities were proving to be more than simply additive. They were creating something entirely new, a supernatural partnership that transcended the individual capabilities either possessed alone. Impossible, Lord Ashford breathed, his political certainties crumbling before evidence that could not be denied or explained away. The old bloodlines were extinct. The records were clear. The records were deliberately obscured to protect surviving families from exactly this kind of political manipulation. Elena, Nightwhisper replied with calm authority. The Blackwood line was never extinct. It was hidden, preserved, maintained in secret until the proper moment for its revelation. As the ceremony reached its culmination, the various supernatural factions that had converged on Ravenshollow Manor were forced to confront the reality that their careful political calculations had been based on incomplete information. The alliance they had sought to prevent or control was revealing itself to be something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Lady Morgana stepped forward with obvious satisfaction. The Vampire Council will have no choice but to acknowledge this union. Ancient magic has validated what political maneuvering sought to prevent. The werewolf clan leaders exchanged meaningful glances before their elders spoke. Our people have long memories of the original Blackwood alliances. If that bloodline truly returns, old treaties and friendships may be renewed. Even the mage families, traditionally suspicious of vampire politics, seemed intrigued by the magical resonance emanating from the ceremony. Power of this magnitude commanded respect, regardless of species, boundaries, or historical grievances. As the final words of the binding ceremony were spoken, the renewed ancestral seal completed its transformation and settled into permanent form above the Great Hall. The symbols that had once represented the solitary strength of the Blackthorn line now incorporated elements that spoke of partnership, community, and the strength that came from genuine connection rather than imposed authority. The blood moon pendant's radiance gradually softened from blinding intensity to warm, steady light that continued to pulse with each beat of Elsbeth's heart. The ancient magic had done more than validate their union. It had transformed both participants, awakening capabilities that neither had possessed individually. Lord Ashford and his supporters found themselves surrounded by supernatural beings whose combined authority made resistance both futile and potentially suicidal. The political calculation that had driven their opposition was collapsing under the weight of evidence that transcended normal vampire society hierarchies. "The binding is complete," Lady Morgana announced with ceremonial formality. "Lord Alaric Blackthorn and Lady Elsbeth Blackthorn are united under laws older than nations, blessed by magic that predates written history." As dawn approached through the Great Hall's windows, the assembled supernatural beings began to disperse with new understanding of the forces that had been set in motion. The marriage they had come to prevent or control had transformed into something that would reshape relationships throughout the supernatural world. The ceremony was over, but its consequences were just beginning. 3 months after the binding ceremony, Ravenshollow Manor bore little resemblance to the neglected estate that had greeted Elsbeth's arrival. The transformation extended far beyond mere physical restoration, though the evidence of renewed prosperity was visible in every carefully tended garden, every polished window, every room that, once again, served its intended purpose. What had truly changed was the sense of life that permeated the ancient walls, the feeling that this was once again a home rather than a monument to faded glory. The new estate foundation stone lay embedded in the restored garden's central fountain, its marble surface, engraved with both Alaric's and Elsbeth's names, intertwined with symbols representing their united bloodlines. They had placed it together during the estate's rebuilding, a cornerstone that represented not just architectural renewal, but the solid foundation of their partnership. The inscription read simply, "Built on love, sustained by truth, strengthened by time." Words that captured the essence of what they had created together. Elsbeth moved through the morning rooms with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world after decades of searching. Her transformation into full vampire heritage had been remarkable, not for its supernatural aspects, but for how naturally she had adapted to abilities that felt less like foreign powers and more like the completion of something that had always been missing. She retained all the practical wisdom and earthy strength that had first drawn Alaric to her, but now possessed the supernatural capabilities necessary to navigate the complex political landscape they had inherited. The estate had become something unprecedented in vampire society, a sanctuary for supernatural beings who found themselves caught between traditional expectations and personal truth. Word had spread quietly through hidden networks about a place where mixed marriages were celebrated rather than merely tolerated, where different species could coexist without the careful hierarchies that typically govern such interactions. Marcus had adapted to his expanded role with characteristic grace, his decades of loyal service now encompassing diplomatic responsibilities he had never imagined. The steady stream of visitors, vampire, nobles seeking alliance, werewolf clan leaders renewing ancient friendships, mage families curious about the magical resonance that continued to emanate from the estate, required coordination skills that transformed household management into something approaching statecraft. Mrs. Hartwell presided over kitchens that once again served elaborate meals to diverse guests, her practical approach to hospitality proving remarkably effective at putting supernatural beings at ease. She had developed an intuitive understanding of various species' dietary requirements and cultural sensitivities, turning the act of sharing meals into a form of diplomacy that accomplished more than formal negotiations. Young Tom, no longer quite so young, but still bearing the title with good humor, had become groundskeeper for gardens that served as neutral meeting space for beings who might otherwise never share the same territory. His careful cultivation of the estate's grounds created environments where ancient enemies could discover common interests in beauty and growth. Alaric found himself occupying a role he had never sought, but was uniquely qualified to fill a bridge between traditional vampire society and the emerging reality of supernatural integration. His centuries of experience, combined with Elsbeth's practical wisdom and genuine caring for others, had created a leadership style that commanded respect without demanding submission. "Lord Ravencrest's delegation arrives this afternoon," Elsbeth said, settling into the comfortable chair beside his desk in the study that had once been his refuge from the world. "They're bringing the formal treaty documents for the renewed Blackwood-Ravencrest alliance." "Morgana was right about the political implications," Alaric replied, looking up from correspondence that arrived daily from supernatural communities across Europe. "Our union has created opportunities for diplomatic relationships that seemed impossible just months ago." The broader implications of their marriage continued to ripple outward through supernatural society. Ancient alliances that had been dormant for centuries were reactivating. Territorial disputes that had simmered for generations were finding peaceful resolution. And the rigid caste systems that had defined vampire politics were adapting to accommodate new realities. Yet for all the political significance of their union, what brought Alaric the greatest satisfaction were the quiet moments of domestic harmony that had become the foundation of their daily life. Elsbeth's presence had taught him that true power lay not in commanding others, but in building something worth preserving, not in maintaining distance, but in creating connections that enriched everyone involved. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Lady Catherine had actually arrived as planned, Elsbeth mused, her weathered hands sorting through invitations to various supernatural social events. We would have had a nutter, perfectly acceptable political marriage that served its diplomatic purpose and left both parties politely dissatisfied. Alaric replied without hesitation. Instead, we discovered that the heart's wisdom often surpasses the mind's careful calculations. The afternoon brought the expected delegation, but also unexpected guests, a small group of young vampires whose recent transformations had left them struggling to find their place in traditional society. They had heard stories about Ravenshollow Manor's reputation as a place where different approaches to supernatural existence were not just tolerated, but encouraged. Watching Elsbeth welcome these lost souls with the same practical kindness she had shown his neglected household, Alaric realized that they had created something far more valuable than political alliance or restored fortune. They had built a legacy based not on bloodline purity or accumulated power, but on the radical idea that love and acceptance could transform not just individuals but entire communities. As evening settled over the estate, they stood together in the restored garden where the foundation stone caught the last rays of sunlight. The fountain bubbled peacefully, the carefully tended beds bloomed with flowers that attracted both natural and supernatural visitors, and the ancient walls that had once enclosed loneliness now sheltered a growing community of beings who had found acceptance after lifetimes of isolation. "No regrets?" Elsbeth asked, her hand finding his as they watched their guests, vampire, werewolf, human, and others share conversation and laughter in the gathering dusk. Only that it took 5 centuries to understand that the best things in life are often the ones we never planned for. Alaric replied, pulling her closer as the first stars appeared overhead. Their love story had begun with disappointed expectations and ended with the discovery that true partnership created possibilities neither could have imagined alone. In building a life together, they had learned that legacy was not about preserving the past unchanged, but about creating a future worthy of the love that made it possible.